Whispers in the Pines. I wasn't supposed to be there. Emberwood Forest wasn't a place you casually strolled into, especially alone. But I was desperate to escape the suffocating monotony of my life. A life filled with spreadsheets, deadlines, and fluorescent lights that sucked the color out of the world. I craved silence. I craved solitude. So, when I stumbled across a forgotten post about a hidden trail in Emberwood, I ignored the warnings. "Don't go too deep," the post had said. "People have disappeared." I rolled my eyes at the melodrama. Every forest had its urban legends. I packed my gear and drove out early the next morning, ready to lose myself in the quiet embrace of nature. But I didn't realize how literal that would become. The trailhead was nothing more than a break in the trees, marked by a weathered sign half swallowed by moss. It read, "Emberwood Reserve, authorized access only." I stepped over the fallen rope meant to keep wanderers out, feeling a thrill of rebellion. At first, it was everything I hoped it would be. The forest was alive with birdsong and the rustle of leaves, a far cry from the constant hum of the city. The path wound through towering pines and dense undergrowth, the scent of damp earth filling the air. I felt free, but as the hours passed, the forest began to change. The first thing I noticed was the silence. The birdsong faded, replaced by an oppressive stillness that seemed to press against my ears. Even the crunch of my boots on the trail felt muted. I stopped to drink from my water bottle, glancing around uneasily. The trees here were taller, their trunks thicker, their branches twisting together in a way that blocked out the sun. The air was colder, heavier. That's when I saw it, the first carving. It was etched into the bark of a tree just off the trail, a crude symbol resembling an eye with jagged lines radiating from it. The grooves were deep, as if someone had carved it with more force than necessary. I stared at it for a moment, then laughed nervously. Probably some kid playing a prank, I thought. But as I continued down the trail, I started to see more of them. The symbols were on nearly every tree, varying in size and complexity. Some were small and simple. Others sprawled across the bark, intricate patterns that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. The further I went, the worse the feeling in my gut grew. I don't know when I realized I was lost. The trail that had been so clear was now little more than a suggestion, barely visible beneath a carpet of leaves and moss. The landmarks I'd been using to guide myself, a fallen tree, a peculiar rock formation, were gone. I tried to retrace my steps, but every turn seemed to lead me deeper into the forest. The trees loomed closer, their gnarled branches forming an almost impenetrable canopy. The symbols on the bark seemed to pulse, though I told myself it was just my imagination. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. "Is anyone there?" The forest didn't answer. I don't remember when I first heard the whispers. They were faint at first, like the sound of leaves rustling in the wind. But there was no wind. The whispers grew louder as I stumbled through the trees, their cadence strange and hypnotic. It wasn't a language I recognized, but the tone was unmistakable. Taunting, mocking. I tried to ignore them, to tell myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. But then I saw the figure. It was just a glimpse. A shadow flitting between the trees, too tall and too thin to be human. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. But when I turned to look, it was gone. The whispers grew louder, closer. I ran. The forest seemed to shift as I moved, the trees rearranging themselves to block my path. Branches clawed at my face and arms, their sharp edges drawing blood. The ground was soft and treacherous, and I stumbled more than once, scraping my palms on the rough earth. Every time I thought I'd gained some distance, I saw it again, always at the edge of my vision, always watching. It didn't move like a person. Its limbs were too long, its gait too jerky, its head tilting at impossible angles. I tried not to look, but it didn't matter. I could feel its eyes on me. By the time night fell, I was exhausted. I found a small clearing and collapsed, too tired to care about the danger. My flashlight's beam wavered as I set up a makeshift camp, the weak light barely penetrating the oppressive darkness. I tried to eat, but the fear had knotted my stomach. The whispers were relentless now, circling me like predators waiting to pounce. And then the figure stepped into the light. It was worse up close. Its skin was pale and stretched too tightly over its frame, its eyes sunken and empty. It had no mouth, but I could hear its voice in my head, a low, guttural growl that filled my skull with static. I scrambled backward, my flashlight shaking in my hand. "Stay back!" I shouted, though my voice cracked with terror. The thing tilted its head, its empty eyes boring into mine. The symbols on the trees around us began to glow, casting an eerie red light that painted the forest in hellish hues. I don't remember screaming, but my throat burned. I ran again, but this time the forest didn't just shift. It fought me. The ground buckled and twisted, roots snaking up to trip me. The trees seemed to close in, their branches clawing at my clothes and hair. The whispers became a deafening roar, drowning out my thoughts. The figure was everywhere now, no matter which way I turned. And then I saw the clearing. At the center of the clearing was a massive tree, its trunk covered in the same glowing symbols. The air around it crackled with energy, the whispers reaching a fever pitch. The figure was behind me, its presence pressing down on me like a weight. I stumbled forward, drawn to the tree despite the terror clawing at my mind. As I touched the rough bark, the whispers stopped. I woke up on the side of the highway, my car parked haphazardly on the shoulder. My clothes were torn, my skin scraped and bruised, but I was alive. The forest loomed in the distance, silent and still. I never told anyone what happened. Who would believe me? But sometimes, late at night, I hear the whispers again, faint and mocking, and I know the forest isn't done with me. Not yet. The forest's call. I should have known better than to listen to Eric. He was always full of bad ideas, and yet I let him talk me into this one. A weekend hike through Emberwood Forest, a place notorious for strange disappearances. The rumors made it sound like some kind of urban legend, but Eric loved that kind of thing. He said it would be fun and adventure. Now, I wish I'd never gone. It started out harmless enough. The drive to the trailhead was quiet, the early morning sun spilling through the windshield. Eric was in the passenger seat, rattling on about the forest's history. "Did you know people say the trees move?" he said, grinning like a kid about to tell a ghost story. "They claim the forest rearranges itself to keep people trapped. And the deeper you go, the harder it is to get out." "Great," I muttered, keeping my eyes on the winding road. "Exactly what I want to hear before we get lost in the middle of nowhere." Eric just laughed. When we arrived, the parking lot was empty except for a single, rusted-out pickup truck. The air was cool and still, the forest towering around us like a wall of shadows. I hesitated for a moment, staring into the dark tree line, but Eric was already strapping on his pack and heading for the trail. "Come on," he called over his shoulder. "We've got daylight to burn." The first few hours were uneventful. The trail was well-worn, winding through dense undergrowth and tall, ancient trees. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting dappled patterns on the ground. It was almost peaceful, the kind of tranquility I'd been craving after weeks of stress at work. But as we ventured deeper, the forest began to change. The trees grew taller and closer together, their gnarled branches twisting overhead like skeletal fingers. The air grew heavier, the silence more oppressive. Even the sunlight seemed dimmer, as if the forest was swallowing it whole. "Does it feel weird to you?" I asked, breaking the quiet. Eric glanced back at me, his grin faltering for the first time. "Yeah," he admitted, "but that's part of the fun, right?" I wasn't so sure. By late afternoon, we'd strayed from the main trail, lured off course by Eric's insistence that we explore. He claimed he'd found a shortcut on his map, but the farther we went, the less it looked like anyone had been there before. The undergrowth was thick, and the trail, if it even was a trail, was barely visible beneath the leaves and moss. It was then that I noticed the carvings. The first one was on a tree near the path, a strange symbol roughly etched into the bark. It looked like a circle with jagged lines radiating out from the center, almost like a crude sun. "Check this out," I said, running my fingers over the grooves. Eric crouched next to it, frowning. "That's weird," he muttered. "Looks old." As we moved on, we found more of them. The same symbol carved into tree after tree, sometimes accompanied by others. Spirals, triangles, shapes I couldn't place. "Maybe it's a trail marker?" Eric suggested, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. I didn't answer. My gut told me these weren't markers. They were warnings. The sun was setting by the time we realized we were lost. Eric's map was useless. None of the landmarks matched, and the compass spun wildly, refusing to settle. "We'll just backtrack," Eric said, though his voice wavered. "We'll find the main trail." But when we tried to retrace our steps, the forest didn't cooperate. Paths we'd taken earlier seemed to vanish, replaced by walls of impenetrable undergrowth. The trees all looked the same, their gnarled branches stretching skyward like silent sentinels. "This isn't possible," Eric muttered, turning the map over in his hands. "We need to stop," I said. "It's getting dark. We'll set up camp and figure it out in the morning." Eric didn't argue. The night was worse. We built a fire, the flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the surrounding trees. The carvings seemed to glow in the firelight, their jagged lines almost pulsing. I tried not to look at them. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no insects, not even the rustle of leaves in the wind. Just an unnatural stillness that made my skin crawl. As we sat by the fire, Eric suddenly tensed, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the light. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I shook my head, though my heart was pounding. "What?" "Footsteps," he said. "Over there." We both stared into the shadows, straining to see. For a moment, there was nothing, just darkness, and then a shape moved. It was tall, almost unnaturally so, with long limbs and a hunched posture. I couldn't make out its face, or if it even had one, but its presence was suffocating. It stood just beyond the firelight, watching us. "What the hell is that?" I whispered, gripping Eric's arm. "I don't know," he hissed back, "but we're not staying to find out." He grabbed his pack and started dousing the fire, but before we could leave, the thing moved closer. Its movements were jerky, almost insect-like, and its head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Run," Eric said, his voice barely audible. We didn't need to be told twice. We sprinted into the darkness, the forest closing in around us. Branches tore at my clothes and skin as I stumbled through the undergrowth, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind me, I could hear it, heavy, uneven footsteps crashing through the trees. "Don't look back," Eric shouted, but I couldn't help it. I glanced over my shoulder, and my blood turned to ice. The figure was closer now, its skeletal limbs reaching out as it moved. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark, and its jagged mouth twisted into a mockery of a grin. I tripped over a root and hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of me. Eric skidded to a stop, grabbing my arm and hauling me to my feet. "We have to keep moving," he yelled, but it was too late. The thing was on us in seconds, its claws tearing through the air. I screamed as it grabbed Eric, lifting him off the ground like he weighed nothing. He thrashed and kicked, but it was useless. "Run," he choked out. "Go." I didn't want to leave him, but terror drove me forward. I ran blindly through the forest, the sound of Eric's screams echoing behind me. And then, silence. I don't remember how I found my way out. One moment, I was running through endless trees, and the next, I was stumbling into the parking lot, my car exactly where we'd left it. Eric was gone. The forest was quiet, as if nothing had happened. But when I looked back, I saw it, standing at the tree line, watching me with those hollow eyes. It hasn't stopped watching since. The shadows beneath the pines. I thought a weekend retreat to the woods would be a good idea. The forest had always been my escape, a place where the chaos of life couldn't reach me. But this time I chose wrong. Blackridge Forest wasn't on any map I could find, just a vague recommendation from a friend who'd said it was, untouched by civilization. That sounded perfect. No distractions, no people. It was supposed to be a fresh start. Instead, it turned into something I can barely explain. The drive there was uneventful, though the directions took me down winding, narrow roads that seemed to disappear into the wilderness. By the time I arrived at the clearing where I planned to set up camp, the sun was already sinking behind the dense canopy of pines. The air smelled of damp earth and moss, and the silence was thick, like the forest was holding its breath. As I unpacked my gear, I noticed how quiet it was. No bird calls, no rustling leaves, just the faint creak of the trees swaying in the wind. I told myself it was normal, that maybe the wildlife stayed hidden when humans intruded. But deep down, something felt off. I brushed the unease aside and pitched my tent, gathering wood for a fire. As the first sparks caught, I sat back and watched the flames dance, trying to relax. It was peaceful in a way, but the kind of peace that felt forced, like something unseen was lurking just beyond the firelight. The first sign of trouble came just before midnight. I was dozing in my tent when I heard it, a soft crunching sound, like footsteps in the underbrush. I froze, straining to listen. The sound was faint but deliberate, moving closer, then stopping. My breath caught in my throat as I unzipped the tent just enough to peer outside. Nothing. The forest was still, the fire reduced to glowing embers. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out, shining the beam into the trees. The light cut through the darkness, but it revealed nothing unusual. Still, the sensation of being watched was overwhelming. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. "Is someone there?" No response, just the quiet creak of the trees. I stood there for what felt like hours before retreating to the safety of my tent, my heart pounding. The next morning, the forest felt different. The air was colder, the light dimmer despite the clear sky. I decided to explore a bit, hoping to shake off the lingering unease. With a small pack and a bottle of water, I ventured deeper into the woods, following a narrow trail that wound between ancient trees. The deeper I went, the stranger it became. The trees grew taller and denser, their gnarled branches twisting together like skeletal hands. The ground was soft and spongy underfoot, littered with blackened leaves that crumbled at the slightest touch. That's when I found the first carving. It was etched into the bark of a massive pine. Symbols I didn't recognize, jagged and crude, arranged in a circular pattern. I ran my fingers over the grooves, feeling the cold, rough texture. The sight of it sent a chill down my spine, but I told myself it was nothing, just some old markings left by someone long gone. But as I continued down the trail, I found more. Symbols on almost every tree, each one more intricate than the last. They seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't explain, as if the forest itself was alive, breathing around me. And then I heard the whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it wasn't. The sound was soft, almost melodic, but it carried an edge of menace. Words I couldn't understand, spoken in a language that didn't sound human. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere at once, weaving through the trees like a ghostly breeze. I turned in circles, trying to find the source, but there was nothing, just trees and shadows. Then the trail disappeared. One moment, it was there, a clear path cutting through the forest. The next, it was gone, swallowed by the underbrush. Panic bubbled in my chest as I tried to retrace my steps, but every turn led me deeper into the maze of trees. The symbols on the bark seemed to glow faintly now, their jagged patterns seared into my vision. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, mingling with the pounding of my heart. That's when I saw it. A figure stood between the trees, barely visible in the shifting shadows. It was tall and thin, its limbs impossibly long, its face obscured by darkness. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I felt its eyes on me. I stumbled back, tripping over a root and landing hard on the ground. When I looked up, the figure was gone, but the whispers remained. I ran. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away. Branches clawed at my face and arms as I pushed through the underbrush, the forest seeming to close in around me. My breaths came in ragged gasps, each one louder than the last. And then, I was back at the clearing where I'd set up camp. Relief washed over me as I stumbled toward the fire pit, but it was short-lived. My tent was shredded, its fabric hanging in tatters. My supplies were scattered, trampled into the dirt. and there, in the center of the clearing, was a new carving. This one wasn't on a tree, it was gouged into the ground, the same jagged symbols arranged in a spiraling pattern. At the center of the spiral lay something I couldn't comprehend. It was black, impossibly black, like a void that swallowed the light. The whispers became screams. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The sound was inside my head, a cacophony of voices shrieking in unison. The ground beneath me trembled, the trees swaying violently as if caught in a storm. The void in the spiral pulsed, growing larger, and from its depths, something began to emerge. Long, skeletal limbs clawed their way out, followed by a face. A twisted, grotesque parody of humanity with hollow eyes that burned into my soul. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. All I could do was watch as it pulled itself free, its laughter reverberating through the forest. And then, everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying in my car, parked at the edge of the forest. My hands were bloody, my clothes torn, but I was alive. The forest behind me was still and silent, as if nothing had happened. I didn't question it. I started the car and drove, never looking back. I've tried to forget, to convince myself it was just a nightmare. But every night I hear the whispers, faint at first, then louder, more insistent. And when I close my eyes, I see the void and the thing that crawled out of it. I don't think I left Blackridge Forest. Not entirely. And I think it's coming for the part of me that stayed. The whispers in the pines. They called it Black Hollow Forest. Locals whispered about it like it was alive, something to be feared and respected. Of course, I didn't believe in ghost stories or curses. I just needed a place to clear my head. A breakup, a miserable job, and a creeping sense of failure had brought me to the edge, and I thought a weekend camping trip alone might help me reset. The forest seemed perfect, vast, secluded, and unspoiled. I didn't listen to the old woman at the gas station when she warned me to stay away. Her voice, raspy and low, echoed in my mind. Things get lost in there. Sometimes people too. I smiled politely and dismissed her words as small-town superstition. That was my first mistake. I arrived late in the afternoon, parking my car at the edge of the forest. The path into Black Hollow was overgrown but still visible, winding between towering pines whose branches knotted together overhead, blocking out much of the sunlight. I followed it for about 2 hours until I reached a clearing with just enough space for my small tent. The air was cool and crisp, filled with the earthy scent of moss and pine needles. It was peaceful, quiet, too quiet. As I set up camp, the usual sounds of the woods, birdsong, rustling leaves, the occasional snap of a twig, seemed muted, almost as if the forest were holding its breath. I told myself I was imagining things, that I wasn't used to the isolation. By the time I finished setting up, the sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. I built a small fire, cooked some instant noodles, and settled in for the night. The darkness was absolute, the kind that swallows everything outside the circle of firelight. That's when I heard it. It started faint, like the sound of a breeze weaving through the trees. But as I strained to listen, it became clearer, whispering. Soft, unintelligible murmurs carried on the wind, too far away to make out the words, but close enough to send a chill crawling down my spine. I turned, scanning the forest beyond the firelight. Nothing, just shadows and the swaying of branches. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. The whispers stopped. Silence pressed in around me, heavy and unnatural. I tried to laugh it off, convincing myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I felt something watching me. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear faint footsteps crunching in the underbrush, always just outside my tent. Once, I thought I saw a figure standing among the trees, but when I shone my flashlight, there was nothing there. Morning couldn't come fast enough. The next day, I decided to explore deeper into the forest, hoping to shake off the unease from the night before. The path I'd followed in was easy to find, so I wasn't worried about getting lost. I hiked for hours, weaving through groves of ancient trees whose gnarled roots jutted out like skeletal hands. The deeper I went, the stranger the forest felt. The trees grew closer together, their bark dark and twisted. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of damp earth and decay. And the silence, it was wrong. No birds, no insects, just the sound of my own breathing and the occasional crunch of leaves underfoot. Then I stumbled across the carvings. The first was etched into the bark of a massive oak. Strange symbols, jagged and crude, arranged in a spiral pattern. I ran my fingers over the grooves, cold and deep, as if they'd been carved with something sharp and deliberate. The more I looked, the more I found. Trees all around me bore similar markings, their spirals growing tighter and more intricate. The whispers returned. This time, they were louder, clearer, as if the forest itself was speaking. They weren't just noises anymore. They were voices, overlapping and urgent, in a language I didn't understand. The air grew colder, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I turned to leave, but the path was gone. Panic set in as I searched for the trail, spinning in circles. The trees all looked the same, their twisted shapes forming an endless maze. I marked one of the carved trees with a strip of fabric from my jacket and started walking, keeping the sun at my back. But no matter how far I went, I kept ending up back at the same tree. The strip of fabric hung there like a cruel joke, mocking me. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I thought I caught movement in the corner of my eye, shadows darting between the trees. "Stop it!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Who's out there?" Laughter answered me, low, guttural, and inhuman. As night fell, I gave up trying to find my way out and focused on surviving. I gathered wood and built a fire, the flames casting flickering light over the surrounding trees. I sat with my back to the fire, gripping the knife from my camping kit, every nerve on edge. The forest came alive in the darkness. Shadows moved where there should have been none, and the laughter echoed all around me. My flashlight flickered and died, leaving me with only the fire's glow. Then I saw it. A figure stood just beyond the firelight, its outline barely visible. It was tall, unnaturally so, with elongated limbs that bent at odd angles. Its head tilted as if studying me, and I could feel its eyes, hollow and unblinking, boring into my soul. It stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. I scrambled back, holding the knife out in front of me. "Stay away!" I screamed, but my voice was swallowed by the forest. The figure stopped at the edge of the firelight, its head twisting in an impossible arc. Then it whispered, a single word that sent ice through my veins. "Run." I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted into the darkness, the firelight fading behind me. The forest closed in around me, branches clawing at my clothes and skin as I ran. The whispers chased me, louder and more chaotic, mingled with the sound of heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush. I tripped over a root and hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of me. As I scrambled to my feet, I saw them, dozens of figures emerging from the shadows. Their bodies were twisted, their faces pale and featureless. They moved as one, closing in around me. I don't remember much after that, just flashes, hands grabbing me, voices screaming in my head, and the sensation of being pulled into the earth. When I woke up, it was morning, and I was lying at the edge of the forest, my car parked a few feet away. I didn't question it. I didn't look back. I just got in and drove. That was 2 weeks ago. I haven't been able to sleep since. The whispers follow me wherever I go, faint at first but growing louder in the dead of night. And sometimes, when I look into the shadows, I see them, those hollow eyes watching, waiting. I don't think I ever really left Black Hollow. I think a part of me is still there, lost among the trees. And I think they want the rest of me too.